focus of this final talk is friendship. Friendship is a key foundation in Carmelite mysticism. And I'm going to let Teresa of Avila be the way that we explore that topic of friendship. So to get ourselves ready, I'd like to invite you to close your eyes. And with your eyes closed, become aware that in this last talk, we sit together as friends, connecting in a way that is incredibly deep, transformative. We are drawn together for the very nectar of what it means to be alive. And so let's sit cognizant of each other's presence. And let's become aware of the presence of all the mystics that have walked with us during this 2 weeks. And all mystics of all realms, of all times, past, present, and future. We are also in the presence and friendship of all beings, of all realms, angels, saints, guides, shamans, holy ones. And let's hold the intention here now that our container, our gathering, may be of the highest, purest energy, and be one wherein we each receive what we are meant to receive for our highest good. And in the words of Hafiz, look at the perfect one, at the circle's center. This one spins and whirls like a golden compass, beyond all that is rational, to show this dear world that everything in existence does point to God. And in the words of Teresa, do not be frightened, my friends, by the many things you need to consider in order to begin this divine journey, which is the royal road to union. A great treasure is gained by traveling this road. No wonder we have to pay what seems to us a high price. The time will come when you will understand how trifling everything is next to so precious a reward. Now returning to those who want to journey on this road and continue until they reach the end, which is to drink from the water of life at the center of their souls. I say that how they are to being is very important, all important. They must have a great and very resolute determination to persevere until reaching the end. Come what may, happen what may, whatever may arrive, even if you die on the road, even if you don't have courage, or if the whole world collapses. Don't pay any attention to the fears that arise within you. And when you are ready, I invite you to open your eyes. So remembering how we started, that we're here to really touch upon the essence of things, that beyond the language, beyond the cultural influences, beyond the belief systems that are or are not different than our own, that what really does beckon us here so that we can taste that water and that nectar is that we courageously move to the very essence of what we're talking about. During our series, I've striven not to take too much liberty in translations of various writings that I've read from various Carmelites, in the hopes that you would drop into the resonance that's there, even if you might speak about it a different way. And this is all important. It's all important. If we look with the beloved's eyes, we will see the beloved's face in all creation. If we look with the beloved's eyes, we will see the beloved's face in all creation. Therefore, this path that Teresa alludes to is that journey to that very place that I read from her that she discovered, the very center of the soul that has the greatest beauty and dignity because it is the eternal wellspring. And that path creates within us, fashions within us the capability to see with those very eyes all things, all situations, all people, all the events of our own lives. And even when we look in the mirror, we see as the beloved sees us. And in that is the great transformation, liberation, healing, enlightenment, if you will. So for Teresa, she saw that friendship was incredibly foundational to this process. She was incredibly savvy when it comes to psychology. I took a course that paralleled her writings to the writings of Carl Jung, and it was amazing how the trajectories and the nuances and the sophistication really were quite similar in different language. And so there's a part of her that seems to have the mechanics of being very grounded psychologically. And in that, there is the unrecognized premise that we are relational creatures. And as being relational creatures, it is within relationship that we evolve and come to the fullness of who and what we are. And she, as a Carmelite, a life given to silence and solitude, so many misinterpretations come around that. I know as being a former monastic, I can't tell you how often I am explaining to people that becoming a monastic is not a moving away from relationship, but rather a moving into the heart of relationship, moving with the clarity that Hafiz speaks of, where the one sight and the one vision is that one very center of all things. So for her, friendship plays a key role in being a contemplative. And this will be a little bit of a dance because for her, friendship is so deeply touching in on prayer, if you will, as prayer deeply involves friendship. In fact, she says that the one primary friendship in the world, in life, is the living being with the living God, period. That friendship is that, the living being with the living God. And in one of the ways she's quoted, I'll read this quote. When she speaks about mental prayer, remember there's many forms and designations of prayer at that time. Mental prayer, she says, in my opinion, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him, her, who we know loves us. The important thing is not to think much, but to love much. And so do that which best stirs you to love. Love is not great delight, but desire to please and be pleased in the divine in everything. When she is asked about a method in the way of perfection, which is really her treatise on what it means to become fully alive as a human being, friendship is one of the key premises. And when she is asked to speak to the notion of the involvement of prayer, she gives a very simple example. She says, what if your friend is standing right before you and looking at you and talking to you? Would you simply turn your back on that friend and walk away or ignore or not answer or not listen? If you loved that friend, you would be present with that friend. And she says, so it is with God. Our call, our method is simply to be present to the one that is ever present, loving us. Now that quote is actually John of the Cross, but I could throw in a few of his as well. So let's get to that. I want to give a little bit of a historical context, and then I want to jump into this friendship and into this foundation for prayer piece. So you probably remember she was born in 1515, and she entered the Carmelite monastery, the Incarnation, when she was in her early 20s. After a bit of suffering and almost dying, she took vows. She lived in community, which was living what is called a mitigated rule of the Carmelite charism, which means the rule was adapted to what seemed most appropriate to the time. And there's wisdom and goodness in that. But in this situation, there was a great movement away from the charism, which was the practice of presence. And she lived in that environment until she had a very dramatic, illuminative experience. Some say it was when she was 39, others say it was when she was 43, but somehow we know it's somewhere in there. During that time, in her early 40s, she is so awakened into and on fire with the practice of this presence and this silence that within her community at the Incarnation, which was 200 nuns, and I've been there, it's a very tiny place. They must have been living on top of each other. 200 nuns who were marginally and somewhere on the spectrum of the same interest as her. So here she is practicing this newfound love of silence and solitude. And she converses oftentimes with sisters, with cousins, with friends of the family. And she begins to devise a desire to just be in a community that had fewer women in it and could have a greater observation of living in solitude and community. And as this desire comes about, which is in her early to mid 40s, it's difficult to know the timing, but it looks like, from many records, I lean in this direction, that one of her cousins found a copy of the primitive rule. That would have been the rule that we covered in one of the other talks from the 1200s. And she had never seen it before. Never seen it before, which to us is surprising with our availability to resources so quickly. But back then, things didn't travel that quickly. And she lives in Spain, which was separated by mountains from a lot of the other Catholic spheres. And she was very moved by this and was wanting, at the invitation of what we think is a cousin, to start a reform. Now, the first inclinations was just because she wanted it for herself and for whoever else was interested. But it escalated just probably because of her notoriety and her love of, she was a bit of an activist, so her love of caring that good things happen for the community and for the world at large. And she was very concerned about the breakups in Christianity. So she became a reformer even before she founded the first monastery right in Avila, not far from the Incarnation. And that monastery was founded when she was 47. She lived there for 5 years, and she established her own, again, with her wisdom and grounded psychology, she established a way of life that was this balance of contemplative prayer and vocal prayer. And there were schools, big divides, that vocal prayer was much more safe and important. The contemplative prayer shouldn't have vocal prayer in it, but she wove both of them. And with that, she also established a rule. She had many rules, but one of them was that all of her communities, and this community, her starting one, would be anywhere between 15 and 21 women, period. It would never be more than that. Why? So that they could be friends. So that they could be friends on the path. And she saw that if it was too big, there was more the likelihood of cliques, of factions, of favoritism. And if it was too small, you didn't have the breadth of living in community. You didn't have the richer experience of everyone contributing to make community. So in her wisdom and insight, she began that. And she drew upon with the contemplative prayer. Remember, I mentioned she was afraid to open up to contemplative prayer. And here's a real old copy of the third spiritual alphabet that she was given in her 20s. And she follows these 3 foundational premises when it comes to contemplative prayer that applies to every person that she meets. The first. Well, let me start with the line above it, because this is the author. Before explaining the alphabet, it will be well to state 3 considerations which appear essential for anyone who seeks to attain union with God. The first is that friendship and communion with God are possible in this life, and that in no small degree, but with a closer and stronger bond than has ever existed between brethren or mother and child. It's pretty strong, right? The second is that this God is no respecter of persons. This communion is no less possible for you, whoever you may be, than for all others. And the third is that whatever the means by which this communion is sought, the soul must feel a solicitude which will not let it rest and is directed solely to seeking this union, this God. Well, you can see right away, even with what she said in the opening reflection, that she was deeply impressed in her early 20s by this particular book and those three considerations. So for her, what is the makeup of community and thus prayer? She doesn't seem to distinguish a lot between the two, that friendship and the beloved right before me is friendship and the beloved in my silence. She notes that there are three foundations to that rich life of union. And the first is love of neighbor. The second is detachment. And the third is humility. And I think in our modern day of spirituality, and I've been fortunate to lead a lot of retreats and attend a lot of retreats, there has been a healing process that has come about in relation to all three of those, but in particular, detachment and humility. Because of the misunderstandings that detachment means you don't have any desires within the world, and that humility means you must consider yourself so last that you're a doormat no matter what happens in your life. But she is absolutely brilliant as she speaks to these three foundations for community, for friendship, and for what we call prayer of union. So not just vocal prayer, not just mental prayer, contemplative prayer, but that experience of ecstasy and bliss. So when she talks about love of neighbor, what she's speaking to is allowing yourself to love your neighbor in such a way that as the neighbor reveals themselves to you, what is evoked is compassion. And she says, since we have natural propensities where we naturally like one person that pleases our senses and naturally do not like another person, that what helps us cultivate that experience of compassion is our spiritual focus on the purpose of the person in our life. Not making the person the object of, oh, you're my polishing stone so that I can be enlightened. Sometimes it may feel that we need to humor ourselves in that way, but rather the purity and the innocence that you're called into relationship for the sake of union. And this applies to every person in your life, regardless of where the tensions may be, where the natural love may be or not. So in that, there is the creative element of what we call interdependence. That we realize that we need all in our lives, and that all in our lives need us. It refreshes us from the other levels and layers that we may be working to be in relationship, from the struggles that may be there, or the confusion, or the loss, or the expectation, or the intense love that seeks for other reasons. What it does is it brings things into focus. And that focus is spiritual focus that is dynamic at all times. And in that way, the very one, I can speak to all creation, but for us human beings, I think we have more tensions and challenges when it comes to interpersonal relations. That very one before us, becomes the agency wherein communion happens. And in that spiritual focus is where miracles happen. Think of a time when maybe you had tension and you didn't know how you were going to go about it. And you needed to work through it. And you were working through it through yourself, and you were trying to show up at is the highest good. And then you surrendered everything into the spiritual focus. You surrendered it, and miracles happened. This is what she's speaking to. And so what she says then is that our wills do not proceed with passion, that passion is harnessed in the movement, but it does not proceed just from the state of what we would call any passion that arises. Now, as we grow in innocence, as we grow in simplicity, we are capable of living with and from great passion because our passion is already aligned with what we might call the universal will or the divine will. So that's what she's speaking of when she speaks of love of neighbor. It is a noble aspiration. But married within that is this detachment. Already you can see how it applies, right? But what she wants to point out with detachment, and again, this is highly Carmelite mysticism. So it's not something that she introduced as new. She comes completely from the experience of understanding how quickly everything comes to an end. When she talks about detachment, she is talking about what I preferred the language of is the wisdom and insight of impermanence. If we truly allow ourselves to be stable in the understanding of impermanence, of insight of impermanence, we find we are naturally detached. We are naturally in right divine order with all other things in our lives. And that what is permanent, we understand as permanent, the unchanging essence of being. And what is impermanent, everything else, we understand. We understand in such a way that it's not just here or it's not just here, but rather we are in motion as impermanent ourselves. And she says there are three qualities that go along this lines with this. And the one is surrender. And surrender is so often a practice, right? I remember I love Pema Chodron's talks, and I know in one of her talks, someone at the end posed the question. I probably have even brought it up here, so I don't know why it's fresh in my mind. That this practitioner of presence was feeling really discouraged because she said, every day I find that I get lost in 10,000 distractions. And Pema, in her characteristic jovial wisdom, said, oh, so you had 10,000 opportunities to return again. How delightful is that? That's what we're talking about when we talk about surrender. That it is normal for us human beings to find ourselves distracted around one or another path, usually under the guise of good, right? I've got to make sure I figure this out before I just surrender. I've got to make sure I handle this right just before I surrender. And what the invitation is with detachment is that you surrender first. You let yourself be moved so you have nothing to lose, and then your actions move from there. And in tandem with that, and slightly differently nuanced, is poverty of spirit and mortification. Now, she comes from a culture that is very given to practices of mortification. And I think I would temper some of that language as we've grown as a species. I think that it does point to something, but I have found in my own working with others that that word has reaped greater challenge and fragmentation and need to heal than it's been actually helpful. Mortification is simply that notion of dying to self, but understood properly, it's dying to the false senses of self. And the action of the will there is surrender, isn't it? And poverty of spirit is opening up with the audacity and the confidence that this wellspring, this essence at the center of your being is so wanting to fill you to capacity so wanting to make love with your whole being that you just radiate that it's a recognition that the limited self is vessel, is the light veil of containment. And therein is the dance, that the poverty of spirit is directly correlated with the richness of spirit. It's a little play on the language, but good to put out there, because oftentimes I find in the Western psyche, there's a movement away from the I and the thou aspects of spirituality, because the I thou aspects, the monotheistic or polytheistic, or the going out of the individual to the universal, that oftentimes that has led to a denial of the healthy sense of self. So the I thou becomes a mechanism by which the person fuels low self-esteem instead of realizes the fullness of self-esteem. But here is the opportunity for us to recognize that there's also, with the I thou, there's also the opportunity to identify where we hang our hat on the idea of who and what we are that doesn't serve us or doesn't serve us anymore. So we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. These vantage points can be illuminating moments of softening in a very all-penetrating way our relationship with our whole self, which includes as well the false senses of self that exist within us until we are whole. And then again, in concert with that is this notion of humility. And you might think that humility is kind of the same as detachment in a way, but it's not quite that. Humility is the freedom from the obsession, concern, worry, and attention to ourselves as individuals, to the esteem. Humility is the fullness of self-esteem. False humility is fueling low self-esteem. But humility is an obedience to the truth of our being. And we get lots of encouragements today, lots of prayers and utterances that remind us, oh, if you could only see the beauty of who and what you are. And I think that we are in our humanity beginning to open to the possibility that assenting to that beauty of who and what we are won't lead us to pride. That assenting to it actually undoes us in such a way that those concepts don't really exist anymore. That we're not identifying in either direction because it's just not the realm in which we are walking. For her, the great example and experience of this is the virgin presence, because she recognizes that this individual that we call Mary, and again, we don't need to know if she lived or didn't live, if she immaculately conceived or didn't or not. It's what it points to archetypally. You may want the devotional, but it's not, doesn't hinge on that. But in that archetype, in that image, in that presentation, there is a wholeness that so much is this person of Mary that it can do nothing less than be pregnant and bear God. It can do nothing less. It is the natural consequence of true humility, because the fullness of self-esteem is there. And Teresa gives the parallel that if we could simply be that way, then we as the soul could do nothing less than be Theotokos in the world, could be nothing less than consciousness in form, nothing less than God bearers. And she says some of the telltale signs is that when a person is truly humble, they are expansive in their being. They're expansive because they're whole, and that wholeness is able to connect with, identify with, be one with all things, and be somehow an individual amidst the interconnectivity. So we have love of neighbor, detachment, and humility. And she points that in this friendship with the divine, that is our one call, the friendship between the living being and the living God, that it happens in the context of all our relationships, and therefore all of our relationships, all of them without any exception, are intended to be spiritual friendships. Now, we can be very practical in this, right? That doesn't mean that you're going to be best friends with everybody. It doesn't mean you're going to resonate with everybody. That doesn't mean that you will find yourself at ease at home or in connection where you like to spend time with everybody. But what it does do is it establishes you in the highest point of freedom, where you can encounter the beloved in all. And do you see, it is not up to you to have to work that out, how the relationships play out. It's up to you to embody presence. And then what is needful will be given to you in the moment. And it lets us live the paradox fully, right? Of being all and yet being an individual, of being connected with all and yet still being on a path that you call your own. So with that, I want to bring this reflection into the discussion. We'll go with a reading of, let me pull it up. Here it is. Okay. So this is a book maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're not, but it's called Prayers of the Cosmos, Reflections on the Original Meaning of Jesus's Words by Douglas Klotz. That's his last name. His first name's Neil, if you don't know who it is. And in the Prayers of the Cosmos, he breaks down the Aramaic prayer that we call the Our Father, or the Our Father, Our Mother. I don't pray the Our Father so much, just simply because the language doesn't quite fit my own utterance. But what he does is he goes into the essential meaning of each of these lines. And the reason I want to segue into our discussion from this particular prayer is because the Way of Perfection that Teresa wrote uses the Our Father as the portal for understanding love of neighbor, detachment, humility, the foundation for prayer, and as the anchor and the portal to ecstatic states, to the full divine marriage, to union. Because if you'll remember in our other talks, that she is one that it's very important not to suspend your faculties, but rather utilize the faculties so that they can be taken up into the God presence. And so in that, she says that having anchor words and phrases and prayers are very important when you're going to open yourself up to what she calls like the prayer of quiet or the prayer of union. Because the source wants to fill us, sometimes these anchor points and words are like giving the limited self a bone, an inspirational bone, so that it can be a portal to the greater union. So I want to read this because I think that what is hit upon in this translation is what she intends. So if you read The Way of Perfection, you might want to parallel it with this. So I'm just simply going to read the words here. The word Abuun means divine parent. Like God, it's genderless, but it also means the oneness, creative flow of blessing, the breath or Holy Spirit, and the vibrations from the Holy Spirit as it touches and interpenetrates form. Heaven in Aramaic presents the image of light and sound shining through all of creation. Hence, for the first line, Our Father who art in heaven, we have this translation: O thou, the breathing life of all, creator of the shimmering sound that touches us. And the next phrase, hallowed be thy name. Help us breathe one holy breath, feeling only you. This creates a shrine inside in wholeness. Therein lies our wholeness, no matter what the body's eyes see. Help us breathe one holy breath, feeling only you. This creates a shrine inside in wholeness. The next line, thy kingdom come, in Aramaic. Desire with and through us the rule of universal fruitfulness onto the earth. And Claude says, it easily could be translated, come into the bedroom of our hearts. Prepare us for the marriage of power and beauty. Either way, we co-create and procreate in partnership with God. Next, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In Aramaic, create in me a divine cooperation from many selves, one voice, one action. It also translates, let all wills move together in your vortex, as stars and planets swirl through the sky. Next line. Give us this day our daily bread. Translation. Grant what we need each day in bread and insight, substance for the call of growing life. And easily translated, animate the earth within us. We then feel the wisdom underneath supporting all. Next line. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Translates, erase the inner marks our failures make, just as we scrub our hearts of others' faults. The bigger harm is the judging of actions and forgetting the divinity of ourselves and others. Next line. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Translates, deceived neither by the outer nor the inner, free us to walk your path with joy. In Aramaic, no one leads us into temptation, least of all God. The word temptation translates distraction. And the final line, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Translated, from you is born all ruling will, the power and life to do, the song that beatifies all from age to age it renews. This could also be translated truly. Power to these statements. May they be the ground from which all my actions grow, sealed in trust and faith. Amen. And we have in there then a modern translation of what you can pull from the essence of Teresa and the Carmelite mystic path, the love of neighbor, the beauty and dignity of the soul, the one essential call to union in wholeness and being that in form, and the facets of humility and detachment that result in freedom, the freedom that leads us to know what to do next, the freedom that leads us to abide in enduring joy. So along that note, I want to open it up to share, and let's just do so like we've done before with popcorn. I can, if you're feeling like you need some prompts, I'll do that. But otherwise, what's hitting you? What's alive in you? From this talk, from the series, what's alive in you? What's your wisdom you want to share with the group?